and welcome to The Exchange, your resource for 1031 market intelligence and education. My name's Tom Wall, partner here at Anchor 1031, and this is episode 2 of our 4-part series discussing the structure of a DST. This episode is one of my favorites, where we take a look at the 7 deadly sins of a DST. I'll give investors an overview of the restrictions that the IRS has put on DSTs to make it eligible for a 1031 exchange. So to jump right in, the concept of the 7 deadly sins of a DST refers to a specific set of activities that a DST sponsor has to avoid in order to maintain the trust tax advantage status per the IRS's Revenue Ruling 2004-86. These restrictions are crucial for ensuring that this DST qualifies for 1031 exchange purposes, and in a lot of ways, it informs the type of assets that DST sponsors ultimately buy and choose to put in the DST structure. So to understand the 7 deadly sins is to understand the DST marketplace. In some ways, these rules force the sponsor to be transparent and limit the opportunity for a sponsor to actually mismanage an asset. However, they can also be very restrictive. They can limit upside potential and pose challenges for certain investments. So without further ado, here are the 7 deadly sins of DSTs. Number 1, there's no renegotiating of terms of existing loans or entering into new loans. Number 2, there's no leasing or renegotiating existing lease. Number 3, there are no major capital expenditures allowed. Number 4, no reinvesting proceeds from a sale of a property. Number 5, excess reserves must be distributed to investors. Number 6, no business operations are allowed. And number 7, no future capital contributions, which means capital calls are prohibited. Now let's take a deep dive into each sin. Sin number 1, no renegotiating loans or entering into new loans. A DST cannot renegotiate existing loans or enter into new financing arrangements. This restriction helps maintain the passive investment status required for 1031 exchanges. But this could mean that investors might miss out on an opportunity to refinance when interest rates go lower and potentially increase their cash flow. Also, DST properties could be forced to sell when the loan matures, even if property values are down or the asset's experiencing temporary challenges. In other words, if your loan comes due and property values are down or your property has a temporary hiccup, sponsor might be forced to sell for a loss. For certain properties that require complex business plans with more moving parts or that rely on a refi, another more flexible syndication structure, like a tenants in common, might be more preferable. So number 2, no new leasing, no renegotiating leases. DSTs are prohibited from entering into new leases or from renegotiating existing ones. This obviously poses a challenge for properties that have frequent lease turnovers, like multifamily units or self-storage facilities. Sponsors know this, and they often circumvent these restrictions by creating a subsidiary that enters into a master tenant lease agreement with the DST, and that means that the sponsor can then renegotiate subleases freely. But this often leads to complicated legal structures with uncertain cash flow strategies and potential hidden tax implications. So make sure you look into how a specific DST is structured with your advisor before you actually invest. Sin number 3, no major capital expenditures. DSTs cannot make significant capital improvements or repairs that are beyond normal routine maintenance. So major expenditures could alter the nature of the investment, and the IRS could deem it disqualified from 1031 exchange benefits. Now, this could be a pro or con depending on who you are as an investor. The rule is often seen as enforcing a conservative business plan. That might appeal to many investors, but some might be seeking more value-add or development-oriented deals with higher potential returns. These investors might prefer an entity like a tenants in common or a TIC, or other types of syndications like LLCs or REITs or limited partnerships to meet their individual investment objectives. So, stated clearly, no major additions can be made to a DST property, so you can't add a new wing or anything like that. Any improvements that are made have to be modest, surface level, kind of aesthetic or amenity type additions. Sin number 4, there's no reinvesting proceeds from the sale of a property. Simply put, if a DST sells a property, the proceeds have to be distributed to investors rather than being reinvested into new properties. In other words, a sponsor can't be buying and selling properties, completing 1031 exchanges within that one DST. They're limited to owning just the properties that it began life with. However, challenges can arise if a DST owns a portfolio of multiple properties. A sponsor has the right to sell each of those properties individually. If that happens, investors will either have to conduct multiple small 1031 exchanges or pay taxes if maybe the sale one portion they get back from a sale isn't enough to warrant doing another 1031 exchange. A sponsor's intention is typically to sell that entire portfolio at once, but it could fail to do so. It could result in a complicated and sometimes annoying tax situation. Sin number 5, excess reserves must be distributed to investors. DSTs are allowed to retain limited capital reserves, typically 3% or so of the property's value. These reserves are intended for normal maintenance and operations and can't be used for significant improvements or changes, and they have to be easily accessible in short-term investments like a cash management account. Excess reserves have to be distributed to investors, so this gives investors a lot more transparency and accountability. They know that the money that comes in from their tenants is going to be distributed to investors. This is great news because a lot of our investors are income focused, and that means that they get to receive their cash flow as it is earned rather than waiting until the property sells and the DST closes to realize that income. Like I mentioned, sponsors are allowed to retain a small amount of capital reserves, so while most revenue is distributed, sometimes a sponsor needs to rebuild up cash reserves if it anticipates economic or operational challenges, down the road. So number 6, no business operations. A DST cannot conduct any business operations apart from collecting rent and paying operating expenses relating to the management of the property. If they engage in any other business activities, that could change the DST's nature and disqualify it from being 1031 eligible. So that means revenue that comes in from tenants of a DST property can only be used in 3 ways: held in cash as reserves, used for property expenses, or distributed to investors. This may prevent the sponsor from mismanaging cash or making poor or irresponsible investments, and ultimately gives investors, some peace of mind that money that comes in is not being invested in anything besides the real estate that they intended to invest in. A lot of investors like this restriction because it limits the opportunity for any sponsor shenanigans. Sin number 7, there's no future capital contributions, which means no cash calls. Investors can't make any additional capital contributions to a DST after their initial investment. Similar to how a DST can't refinance, it also can't raise any additional equity from investors. This makes sure that the investment is static and prevents modifications that could alter the nature of the trust in the eyes of the IRS. The inability to conduct a capital call without risking the 1031 eligibility of a DST means that sponsors have to maintain substantial capital reserves, which might be taxable and restricted to property expenses. Some investors prefer entities that allow for capital calls. They enable investors to inject additional capital when needed while keeping the initial funds invested elsewhere instead of raising those capital reserves up front. Removing the requirement for substantial reserves up front also mitigates the small risk that the reserve fund could trigger a small tax consequence for a 1031 exchanger. In other words, because DSTs can't do additional capital calls, often they maintain a hefty reserve fund. Well, if that fund becomes too large relative to the price of the property, it could be considered boot, meaning that part or all of it could be considered taxable. Some investors would rather keep their cash out of the investment and then contribute more down the road if needed through a capital call. So if you're an investor that wants to keep your cash out of the deal and allow the sponsor to be more flexible and potentially have to add cash through a capital call throughout the life of that property, then something like a tenants in common might make more sense for you. So DSTs have to adhere to these restrictions in order to maintain their status as 1031 exchange eligible and allow investors to defer capital gains while investing in real estate. Prospective 1031 exchangers looking for a passive investment should carefully review the structure of their options, make sure that the alignment of their goals and risk tolerances is right for that specific structure. Now that's all for this video. Next time we're going to take a deeper dive into the master tenant lease structure and how sponsors manage lease restrictions. My name is Tom Wall, partner at Anchor 1031. Thank you so much for checking out Exchange Insights, your resource for 1031 intelligence and education. Sign up on our website at anchor1031.com if you'd like to talk to me or anyone on our team about your situation.